Today on the Lunduke Journal, we're going to be talking about BBSs, old ones, like from the 1980s and 90s and late 70s, and why today, in the year of our Lord 2020, they are still awesome. In fact, in many ways, they are more awesome than ever. I have a corresponding article to this up at the Lunduke Journal. Go to lunduke.com. You can read it there. I can read it to you here, and we can talk about it as I go. I've got a few things to say. Let's dive on into it today. So here we are, the year 2020, the future. Seriously, it's 2020. Does that not ring in anyone's head as, oh my gosh, we are so far into the future right now? Do you remember when the year 2000 was the future, and now we're in 2020? And 2010 was the year we made contact. 2001 was the year we found the monolith on the moon, or at least that's what was supposed to happen. But I digress. We've got more internet-based services than you can possibly shake a stick at. No matter how many sticks you've got, you can't shake that many sticks at that many internet services. And yet, with all of those modern advancements, there's one decades-old technology that is proving surprisingly useful and tons of fun: the BBS. I suppose there are other old technologies that are still proving quite useful, but the BBS certainly is one of them. Back in the 1980s and a pretty big chunk of the 90s, most people who did something online with their computers were doing so via modem, a POTS line, also known as plain old telephone service, with those old copper lines, analog, nothing digital there, and a dial-up bulletin board system, also known as a BBS. Sure, some people had America Online and Prodigy and CompuServe, but even during the periods of time that those sorts of online services were existing, and remember, for those of you who weren't around then, America Online didn't have internet service initially. Neither did Prodigy or CompuServe. They were standalone networks. They had internet gateways that opened up as time went on, but initially they were their own little dial-up services. But with BBSs, you could send email, you could take part in conversations and message forums, download files, upload files, play games, some of the best games ever. It was all there. Everything that we do on the internet, at least for the most part, was there. These BBS systems provided the key things that we use the internet for nowadays in 2020. And that was back in the 80s, albeit it was on a much smaller scale. BBSs had a limited number of phone lines available, and each phone line could, for obvious reasons, only support one caller at a time, not to mention the much lower speeds from 300 baud up to about 56K. During the height of BBSing, people were often using things like 14.4 and 28.8 modems. I started my BBSing career with a 2400 baud modem. To put that in perspective, if any of you have ever used a 56K modem, my 2400 baud modem, it was the dot after that. It was not yet to the K mark. You could watch as the characters appeared on screen. And if any of you have had the luxury of ever using a 300 baud modem, it was fascinating because it's roughly about how fast you can read. You see the text appearing on the screen. In some cases a little faster, in some cases a little slower, but about as fast as you can read. You can watch it on the screen. It was fascinating. And these systems were almost always, with a few very rare exceptions, text-based, for obvious reasons, based on the fact that many of the systems connecting to them were text-only terminals, and in other cases, simply because the amount of bandwidth you had available was so incredibly small. You guys hear that? Right there, that is a leaf blower outside my house. He's like, don't talk about BBSs. I will blow leaves around, young Lunduke. Go away, leaf blower. And I include a screenshot here in the video in the article version of Trade Wars, right? Because typically they were made a bit more colorful with the use of what was known as ANSI color codes. So they take ASCII text and you add ANSI codes onto them, and you can do basic text animations and colors and all sorts of things. This is Trade Wars 2002 for those of you seeing the video version of this, and that's the opening screen, or one of the many opening screens. Honestly, it's very cool looking. Some of the ANSI games from that era are incredibly cool looking, even though they're made with just ANSI blocks and characters around the screen. Though that shouldn't really be an impediment to people enjoying it. Most of the really big popular indie games that come out of the last decade or so have all been pixel art or Minecrafty or voxel based anyway. So really, it's not too far of a jump to say, well, let's do everything in ASCII and ANSI. Nowadays, there aren't that many users of BBSs, at least not in most parts of the world. There are a couple of areas in the world where some BBSs remain popular ways for people to communicate, but that is a rarity. In fact, you'll find there really aren't that many BBSs running with an actual active user base. I have one with a decently active user base, but my BBS is a rarity. Thanks in part to the popularity of the show, the BBS does pretty well, but people who just start BBSs, they tend to be pretty small. Most that are still up and running in 2020 are no longer available via dial-up. And so few people have traditional POTS lines, plain old telephone service, those copper lines, that you really can't do it. Instead, most BBSs have moved to be accessible via the internet, on Telnet, via Telnet on the internet. So you can hop online with your high bandwidth, 50 gigawatt internet connection and use Telnet to access BBSs, much like you would have if you just dialed them up with a normal phone line. Just as a side note, you can find the most exhaustive list of currently running online BBSs at the Telnet BBS Guide. I've got a link in the article there, which also has some great resources for getting up and running. This article here helps you out and gives you some good links, but if you really want to dive into it, I recommend checking out the Telnet BBS Guide. It's a great resource for this sort of thing. All right. In theory, you can use any communication program that supports Telnet to call a BBS system, right? However, in practice, you'll want to utilize a Telnet client that is specifically designed to support both ANSI text, because you want those fancy looking artworks, right? As well as at least one of the more common file transfer protocols that BBSs tend to use, such as X modem, Y modem, or most commonly Z modem. Which honestly, I should almost do a full article around the history of that. X modem came before Y modem and Z modem, but Z modem was by far the most popular throughout especially like the early and mid 90s. Was very popular. X modem is really based off of Ward Christensen, who really created BBSing. He was the first person to make his own BBS. He rolled his own system and everything. And he created a simple mechanism for transferring files around. And eventually that became declared as X modem. Y modem was a bit of an addition on top of that to add some additional features. And Z modem just added a ton of new features, like the ability to resume transfers, which didn't exist in the previous ones, and all sorts of things. But those are the upload and download protocols. And personally, I recommend SyncTerm or Netrunner in terms of great clients for accessing BBSs. Both are available on a wide variety of platforms, especially SyncTerm. You can get that for a whole bunch of things. And both support the key BBS functionality that will help make your BBS experience much better and closer to what BBS users had back in the day. All right, all that out of the way, we've got a very big question to ask. But why? To paraphrase a wise man, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could use BBSs in 2020, they didn't stop to think if they should. I'm sure Dr. Ian Malcolm would have said this about BBSs had it not been for the dinosaurs. Let's be real. The dial-up BBS was great in its day. Do we really need to be encouraging the usage of such old, decidedly unmodern technology here in 2020? BBS is over Telnet. That's not over SSH. Those aren't encrypted lines. Oh, that's a concern. We're just talking about text, ASCII and ANSI text. Oh my goodness. We're not even talking about like FTPing files around, right? Or this is a whole different ball of mostly abandoned technologies. Should we be using that in 2020? In my opinion, the answer is a resounding heck yes. And here's why I think we, as a people, should seriously consider embracing BBS usage in the modern era. You guys can disagree with me on this, but I think these are some pretty valid reasons. These reasons, some of these reasons can be accomplished with other technologies in other ways as well. Some of these things can be fixed without using a BBS. However, a BBS is simply a very fun, easy way to address these issues. Number one, smaller, reasonably sized communities. Humans were not built to hold conversations with hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people all at once. Yet this is the reality that social media like Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, blah, 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 creates. We've done studies. We've got the common sense observations that me, you, and everyone else has made. That sort of thing causes heightened levels of anxiety and depression. We've even heard from executives from Facebook who have said they won't let their families near social media because they know the damage it does. They know that it doesn't promote good conversations. They know that it makes people sad because they use them. They know that. They take advantage of that in order to make money off of your information. So since we know it's bad, I think we can deduce that it's just a plain bad idea. And that's one of the reasons I've sworn off social media as a New Year's resolution. The BBS almost completely solves that problem. Well, it's entirely possible to have a BBS with an active user base of thousands of people. It happens. That's not the norm, not by a long shot. The majority of BBSs consist of smaller, focused groups of people, often organized around some commonality, a geographic location, interests, personalities, languages, religions, hobbies, specific video games, interests in specific computing platforms, or sci-fi, fan fiction, all sorts of things. BBSs will tend to focus on one, two, or maybe three, a couple of specific groups, niches, subgroups even. And so you have smaller communities. And with setting up and running a BBS being a fairly straightforward process, more on that later, the barrier to getting your own BBS going is pretty darn low. Don't like any of the existing BBS communities that are out there? Don't like my BBS? No problem. Do you want one for your friends, just for your friends, or maybe just for the coworkers within your company, or maybe for your particular project or community or church or whatever? A few hours later, go through a couple tutorials, and my own BBS can be up and rocking. Thus ensuring that BBS communities maintain just the right size for any person's taste. Just as a side note, check back here at the Lunduke Journal later this week for a detailed walkthrough on how to set up your own Telnet BBS using an extremely inexpensive, like $10 or less virtual server or on your own hardware. I was going to actually post this on Friday. I have the tutorial already, and then I realized I didn't have a way to introduce BBSing and why I thought this was important. So I wrote this article to show everyone why I think this is important and why I think this is fun and why I think this is interesting to do, even as just an experiment or a hobby nowadays in 2020. And then tomorrow or the next day, I'll release the tutorial for it. The tutorial is going to go through setting it up either in a virtual machine or SSH'd into a server like one of the servers from Linode that you can do for just a couple of bucks a month for setting up a server. The great thing with BBS is they use so few system resources. You can set up a very inexpensive virtual server, put it in a virtual machine on one of your boxes, put it on a dedicated machine that you have at home connected to the internet somewhere, and you can have a server serving huge numbers comparatively of BBS users simultaneously and just have a ton of fun with very little time. It's absolutely fantastic. All right. Second reason I think BBSs are worthwhile in 2020 is that you have no mega corporation control. You can run a BBS. Your friend can run a BBS. Some dashingly handsome rogue on the internet can run a BBS, right? Anyone can. You know who does not run an old school BBS? Facebook, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, Apple. Name a company you do not trust. Think of a company, any company you really don't trust. That company doesn't run a BBS. I'm near 100% certain they don't run a BBS. Censorship, shadow banning, data collection and spying. No big company is going to be doing any of that to you when you are connected to a BBS. It's just not going to happen because they don't run them. And if they do run them, you just don't have to use them. Go use someone else's BBS, right? Those BBSs can have some of the same features, some of the same games, even be running some of the same software. And if you don't like it on one BBS, you can just go to another one. Actually, that was the very next paragraph. If you don't like the way a particular BBS is being run, just ask the sysop, which is short for system operator, which is the person who is the primary administrator of a system. Sometimes you'll have multiple sysops on a BBS and whatnot. But typically it's just one person that is the sysop for a system. They are God for that particular BBS, right? And if they can make the change and you ask nicely, maybe they will. But if you don't like what they say, if you don't like their answer, if you don't like how they're running the system, it's no big deal. Like, it's not a big deal. You can literally just go over to another BBS. There are so many BBSs in the proverbial sea. It is crazy. Or at least there can be. Number 3, support for nearly every computing platform. This is a big deal for me, and I know it's a big deal for some of you as well. Have you ever tried to use a modern online service like Twitter, Facebook, any of those sorts of things on older computers or with older software, such as a web browser that is more than just a couple years old? They just don't work. At least not most of the time. Either the SSL technology is out of date or not supported by the software because it changes every 3.5 seconds, or the HTML and the JavaScript and the doodads and the DHTMLs, whatever. They'll get out of date massively fast. Because the reality is web browsers aren't web browsers anymore. They're gigantic multi-virtual machine application frameworks and containers. And it's every couple of years, enough has changed where you might as well be using something almost entirely different than what it was 5-10 years prior. That's just how it is. You know what works on darn near every computing platform on the planet? The BBS. Yeah, it does. If a computing platform has a Telnet client, any Telnet client, and in many cases, even if a platform doesn't have a Telnet client, you can still use it to call a BBS. In fact, if you've got an old computer from, let's say you've got what's a good example here? You could have a Commodore 64. Is there a Telnet client on the Commodore 64? No. At least you didn't have one back in the day. There's hardware you can get nowadays that actually make it possible to use standard communications packages for the Commodore 64 or DOS or old Apple IIs that you would use back in the day to use an old 300 baud modem to call a BBS. Well, you can use those now to Telnet into a Telnet accessible BBS. I have a USB to serial adapter that I can plug into Commodore 64, my TRS-80 behind me, an old Macintosh, whatever, that doesn't have internet connection. And I can plug that in and use a thing called TCP to serial, to basically make it emulate a modem. There's also hardware you can get. There's the Wi-Fi 232 project out there that is just a little tiny piece of hardware that it acts like a modem. It emulates a Hayes compatible old modem. You stick it into the back, the serial port on whatever computer, your IBM PC compatible, and use whatever old application you'd use to dial up a BBS and use your old style modem commands to connect to a Telnet accessible BBS. Anything has the ability to contact and connect to and utilize a BBS. Old systems, new systems, unpopular or alternative systems. There's great Telnet clients available for Haiku and FreeBSD and Amiga OS and MorphOS and so many things. Everyone is welcome. Everyone can communicate, play, and exchange files with each other, regardless of who you are, how fast your connection is, what software you're running, what hardware you're running, all the same. It's a level playing field. Cool, right? I think that's cool. I think that's a big deal. Plus, that gives you increased personal privacy. Think about all this. Think about everything we've got. There's no big company monitoring you all the time. So while BBSs weren't necessarily focused on encryption and the like, because there's no company controlling it, you get, by default, increased personal privacy, support for a wider range of hardware and software, manageable community sites, there's no corporate censorship, and it's a ton of fun. If those aren't good enough reasons to embrace the BBS in 2020, I don't know what is. Those are cool. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting we completely ditch every modern aspect of the internet. There's plenty of things the BBS cannot do, at least not well. Video chat, for example. You're not going to watch this video on a BBS. You're just not going to do it. I mean, I guess you could have some sort of encoder that re-encodes it into an ANSI animation and displays that, which would be cool all by itself, but then you're not going to have the audio, and that's going to be a problem. So that's going to be an issue. And so video chat, maybe that's straight out. We're going to have YouTube or library or any of those video catalog type applications inside of a BBS? Probably not. But it does a lot of other stuff well. BBSs are great for what they're great at, and I feel like we should embrace that. And there's so many little things that the BBS does well. Areas where significant portions of the modern internet fail spectacularly, like the ones I've mentioned here. Ignoring BBSs seems like a silly mistake at this point. Yes, we're talking old school tech here, but old doesn't mean bad. Old just means old. Sometimes old is better. Sometimes old is worse. Sometimes old is just plain different. Sometimes, a lot of times, we don't use old tech simply because it's not compatible with newer tech. And that's not my fault. And that's not your fault. That's the fault of the people making the newer tech. Now, if you want to give this a spin, if you want to dip in your big toe in the waters of the BBS world, I have a Telnet accessible BBS system set up. It's called the House of Lunduke BBS. You can find more information if you go to lunduke.com. There's a little BBS link on the left-hand side. But you can just Telnet into it at bbs.lunduke.com on port 23. Port 23 being the common one here. That's the one pretty much everyone uses. Grab one of those Telnet clients I recommended earlier in this article. I highly recommend SyncTerm. It's fantastic. Netrunner is not open source, but it's also quite good if you don't mind it not being open source. The BBS, it's free to use, right? I don't charge anyone. I don't monetize the system in any way whatsoever. The House of Lunduke BBS exists both to preserve some aspects of 1980s and 1990s BBSing, mostly the games, because I love the games, as well as provide me with a fun BBS to use because I dig it. And for those of you watching the video version or reading the article, that's what it looks like. That's like when you go to log into it, it shows you that right there, and you can set everything up and it's rock and roll. I highly recommend people give it a shot. If you don't like my BBS, that's fine. If you don't like the BBS experience, that's fine. But I think it's valuable. If you currently work in web design, web development, if you build online applications, do server-side stuff, and you've never really experienced BBSing, or you haven't logged into a BBS in 20 or 30 years, try it. Try it and feel what it's like. See where it's distinctly different, because there are such significant areas where the BBS, in my opinion, excels. Some of that could be copied by people building modern systems, and I think they should. Some of that, it's hard to copy in some of the more modern systems because some of the benefits of BBSing are inherently there because it's older technology, right? Because a lot of the people were connecting over text-only terminals. Therefore, you have this text-only interface, which resulted in the ability to contact BBSs and use BBSs from a much wider array of hardware than you would a non-text-based system, something more graphical, right? So it's fascinating. It's worth looking at. It's worth using. I love them. I love BBSs, especially like Trade Wars. Trade Wars is one of my favorite games of all time. Remains one of my favorite games. It's fantastic. It's one of those immersive strategy games that you can play 5 minutes a day, right? And it's just fantastic. Legend of the Red Dragon, Exodus, The Pit, just fantastic games. And if you are going to follow along when I start setting up this BBS with the next article, not this BBS. My BBS is already set up, but I'll show you how to set up your own BBS. Go to linode.com/Lunduke, and you can get a $20 credit if you're a new subscriber towards setting up your server. What's cool is you can set up a $10 a month server over at Linode. So you get a low-end VPS server at Linode. We'll SSH into it and get everything set up on that. And then you can have your own BBS running for $10 or less per month. And you'll have tons. I mean, if you're running a BBS, you don't need, at least for the most part, most people don't need, terabytes of storage. We're talking, simple text games. And even if you're sending files around, you're probably not sending around, giant ISOs of Linux distributions and 15 gigabyte video files, right? You're doing it with smaller stuff. And that's great. So a smaller amount of storage, a smaller amount of RAM, all of that's going to be fine. Heck, even smaller amount of bandwidth is fine because, again, this sort of thing ran great at like 14.4 speeds. At back when you were transmitting 1 or 2K per second, it ran awesome at 1 or 2K per second. Awesome. So linode.com/Lunduke if you want to get set up. The video for an article for documenting and walking through how to get set up with your own BBS server will be out either tomorrow or the next day. I'm trying to spread videos out a little bit. I'm trying not to clobber everything all at once. So I'm trying to stagger things at least a little bit. What are you going to do? Or if you want to run your own server, if you really want to go overkill about it, go over to pogolinux.com. And click on servers, right? Check out these servers. Hold on, what was I going to look at here? Oh yeah, custom rack mount server. So let's say I want to put in, let's say an AMD EPYC server. Oh yeah, what am I looking at here? Oh, look at these guys. Here we go. Oh yeah, baby. Here we go. Let's get a 2U AMD EPYC 7002 series with 4 terabytes of RAM. 24 hard drive, babe. I'm telling you right now, that's going to run a BBS well. And you can set it up on there too. Obviously, having this a massive amount of power is overkill for a BBS. But if you're doing something else a little less, let's say just low bandwidth, just a couple of text connections at a time, go check out pogolinux.com. The servers they put together are the best. Also, their workstations are second to none. I have never seen a workstation of as high a quality as the one that's sitting behind me here that came from Pogo Linux. Just absolutely the best. And again, if you want to get the latest article I put out, the latest video I put out, the latest audio podcast I put out, go to lunduke.com. Along the left-hand side at the Lunduke website, you'll find all the feeds, the RSS feeds and the iTunes feeds and the library links and the YouTube links if you're so inclined, and everything else that you need there to just grab and get the show whenever the latest one comes out. All right, everybody. That's it for today. Thanks for listening to me ramble on about BBSs incessantly for the last 29 minutes. But it is truly a cool piece of technology that I think at this point in time is underutilized. And I think honestly, there's a space for BBSing to not just make a comeback, but to become a more permanent fixture as a part of our broader communication, gaming, etc. landscape that currently isn't being served by social media and various similar websites and services. All right. Maybe you guys agree with me. Maybe you don't. Either way, You just listened to me talk about BBSs for almost half an hour. And that's a win right there. All right, this has been the Lunduke Journal. I will see you guys tomorrow or the next day. I don't know. I'm a loose cannon. See you guys then.